Thanks, everyone. And it's a pleasure to be joining you this afternoon. I'm Maureen Meadows. I'm a professor in CBIS, the Centre for Business and Society at Coventry University. And with my colleagues, we've been working with Sandra and Echo colleagues to explore this really interesting data set on Britain's most admired companies. If anyone was at the session 12 months ago, then we took a deep dive into, as Sandra said, 32 years of data. What I'm going to do today is just look at the most recent year, so the 2021 data, and very quickly, in just a few minutes, give you a quick overview of some of the interesting findings that we think are worthy of some more exploration as well, in many cases. So I'm going to start with a slide that you've already seen. Sandra's already explained the approach that the survey takes with the 13 criteria. And we've got in the top right there the 4 table stakes, and in the yellow oval we've got the 4 circle of opportunity criteria. One of the things we wanted to look at, it seems a really good question as a starting point, is whether companies who are strong in some areas are also strong in other areas, or whether conversely there are potential areas of weakness. We split the data set into the high, the medium and the low performers across all the criteria, starting with the highest performing companies and looking at those table stakes. We did find, you won't be surprised, that the 4 criteria there is a really strong association between performance on those 4. But looking at, as we come to the mid and the low performing companies, the story gets perhaps a little more surprising. From the 2021 data, we're saying that quality of management and financial soundness is the bedrock, but that quality of goods and services tends to drop away a little bit with the medium performing companies. It's not so strongly associated with quality of management and financial soundness. And indeed, as we go to the low performing companies, long-term value potential drops away as well, which I think is a very interesting story, given that companies are often criticised for a short-termist attitude, right, damaging perhaps their own performance and that of the economy. So a little bit of an interesting story there around the table stakes criteria, with quality of management and financial soundness being really strongly aligned, but the others perhaps slightly less so. If I can just make some similar comments about the circle of opportunity, so the yellow oval that you've got there. Even for the high performing companies, what we were seeing is inspirational leadership being really important and strongly linked to the effective ESG and the ability to attract and retain top talent. Capacity to innovate, not quite so strongly linked. So I think this builds really well on what Sandra's just been saying a few moments ago, is perhaps innovation being an area where some companies are still finding it a challenge, still finding their way through that. And that's for the high performing companies. For the mid and the low performing companies, we also see effective ESG drop away a little bit as well. So not so strongly correlated with the inspirational leadership and the top talent criteria. So I think some interesting stories there about the areas that companies are still finding challenging, in line with Sandra's previous comments. What I'm going to do is very quickly take you through some visualizations of the data. Again, this is the 2021 data. We're going to start with some of the strong performances by sector. We're not looking at individual companies, but as Sandra's explained, there are 27 sectors, and we're just going to pull out a few of those, look at some strong performances, a few of the weaker performances, and a few where there's some variation, let's say, across table stakes and circle of opportunity. And I'll end with a slide on diversity, equity and inclusion, because that is of course, such a hot topic in the media, in boardrooms and so on at the moment. So if I can look very quickly at some strong performances. The way to read these slides, of course, is that the 13 criteria are around the circle, and the red dotted line represents an average performance, an average across all of the respondents. So what this slide shows really clearly is just a couple of the really strong performers. Engineering and machinery is the blue line, yellow for heavy construction, as 2 sectors that they're scoring clearly above average. Engineering and machinery above average in all areas. It's the top sector for inspirational leadership and capacity to innovate, for example. And heavy construction is the top sector for the top talent criteria, the ability to attract and retain top talent. Another few high performers, just some brief comments on those. The home construction sector is a purple line here. That's the top sector for long-term value potential at about 4 o'clock on the chart, if you can see that. And effective corporate governance is also the top sector for that, which comes at around 10 o'clock on the chart. Business support services is an interesting one, the orange line, where that stands out if you look at about 9 o'clock on the chart at the commitment to diversity, equity and inclusion, a really strong performance in that sector on that particular criterion. And finally, on this slide, we've got the food producers and providers. So the green line, a good above average performance. As we can see, it sits outside the average. One interesting area, if you look down at about 5 o'clock on the slide, we've got quality of marketing down at the bottom there. And there you can see that the green line just ticks a little bit below the average. So I think one of the interesting things here is those variations in performance and the ability for companies and for sectors to perhaps share experience and learn from each other. A very quick look at a couple of the weaker performances on this slide. Well, we've got restaurants and pubs. Given that it's the 2021 data, I don't think I need to say any more about that one. If we look at the oil and gas sector, which is a green line, again, a below average performance, so lying inside the average, with a strong performance on quality of management. So if we look at 12 o'clock, that's ticking a little bit above the average. There, the telecom sector is a very interesting one in the 2021 data. So the dark red line, the telecom sector is in the bottom 3 for all of the table stakes for quality of management, financial soundness and so on, yet there are areas of strength. So if you look at about 3 o'clock, about the ability to attract and retain top talent, you can see that dark red line ticks over the average. So again, scope for different sectors and for different companies to learn from each other. A couple of slides just showing this variety and the variation across the profile, even of a single sector, in a little bit more detail. The dark blue line is transport. If we start up at 12 o'clock, we can see that it's below average on some of the important table stakes criteria like quality of management and financial soundness. Yet it's above average if you carry on round from 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock, some of those other circle of opportunity criteria around top talent, long-term value potential, innovation, and so on. So quite a varied performance there in that sector across the different table stakes and circle of opportunity. Utilities is the light blue sector. Sandra mentioned utilities again in her introduction. Some strong performances there. What perhaps stands out, if you look down at about 7 o'clock, we've got the effective ESG, where we've got a strong performance there from utilities, yet below a below average performance. If you look up at about 2 o'clock, the quality of the products and services, below average there. So again, I think it's very interesting, these profiles across the different sectors and areas of potential strength and weakness. A final one on the variations. Perhaps what stands out on this slide is the grey line, which is metals and mining. And that sector is very strong on table stakes criteria. If you look up around 12 o'clock to 2 o'clock, you can see it's doing very well. Quality of management, financial soundness, quality of products and services. Some of the areas of improvement, potentially, if you look down at about 7 o'clock at the effective ESG, a below average score there for the grey line for metals and mining. Also innovation at 5 o'clock, a below average score for the grey line on the metals and mining. And finally, for this slide, I'll just mention financial services, which is the pink line on this slide. Some strengths in some areas. So again, 7 o'clock, if you look at the effective ESG, above average performance there for financial services. Yet some of the leadership and management areas are not strong. If we look at inspirational leadership at 8 o'clock, below average. If we look at quality of management at the top, 12 o'clock, below average. So some real variation in those profiles, I think. One final chart from me, just to look at diversity, equity and inclusion. As as we know, such a hot topic for all kinds of stakeholders at the moment. So I wanted to show you a couple of sectors that have, some areas of good performance, some areas of strength, but are struggling on the diversity, equity and inclusion. So diversity, equity and inclusion is at about 9 o'clock, and you can see that both the blue line for chemicals and the greenish line for consumer digital services are below average there. The chemicals line obviously has areas of strength, such as financial soundness up at 1 o'clock. So, again, quite a mixed profile for that sector. And the consumer digital services has got strengths, for example, at 2 o'clock on quality of products and services. But both of those are sectors that really stand out for the commitment to diversity, equity and inclusion criteria as one that perhaps is challenging at the moment. So if I can just sum up some of the insights, there's obviously much more that can be said, and perhaps looking forward to some discussion and questions later. But what we've seen, I think, is some real alignment across the 4 table stakes criteria for the high performing firms. However, for the medium and low performing firms, we do see that quality of goods and services isn't always well aligned, and we do see that long-term value potential is not always well aligned with good performances on the quality of management and the financial soundness. Across the 4 circle of opportunity criteria, the effective ESG does really stand out as a challenge, particularly for the medium and low performing firms in the data set. And as we've just seen, commitment to diversity, equity and inclusion is another challenging area for many respondents. So a fascinating data set. I think there's lots to learn for companies and for sectors, looking at the profiles and the areas of strength and weakness across those. There's much more that can be said, but I'll stop there and hand back to Sandra. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maureen. I know we're going to be running up against our fireside chat with our winner, but we do have a question from Mike Miller. Mike, if you're with us, would you like to unmute yourself? There we go.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, just quickly, I had a question about the tangible versus intangible assets chart. Turn my light on here so you can see me better. Whether things like IP, patents, whether that's counted as tangible or intangible. I apologize for not being a financial accounting expert, because that's that kind of question. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, Mike. And it is, you're absolutely right. In intangible, you've got IP, you've got all sorts of property law, you've got a lot of things sitting in intangible that don't sit on traditional balance sheets. And if it's of interest, for those with us today, we'll send you through the decks that we've been sharing, so you'll have that. And I'll also attach the latest paper for the IFRS Foundation looking at value reporting, and they talk about how they're qualifying intangible assets as broadly as they can. So delighted to share that with you. So yes, so in sum, reputation was only part of all those intangibles. It's not the whole intangible. It's only part of that overall area. Rosie, I think we've got time for your question, and then we'll lead on to Matthew. Rosie, would you like to raise your question?
Sure, and I guess it's an easy question with a very complicated. Oh, am I unmuted?
You're unmuted.
Okay. It's an easy question with probably a lot of complicated answers, but obviously when you look at those different criteria, there's a lot of correlations, intersections between them. So when I look at, for instance, capacity to innovate on research that I've been involved with in the past around diversity, equity, and inclusion can have a big impact on capacity to innovate. So you have the same question in terms of is quality of marketing affecting effective ESG, because that's where the greenwashing comes in, etc. So I don't know if that's whether you're actually looking into that at some point to see the intersections of what that can actually tell us more specifically.
Thank you, Rosie. Maureen, if Maureen's still with us, Maureen, because I know Maureen was looking at the intersection of the different criteria, particularly over time as well. Is Maureen with us? Maureen, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, yeah, just managed to unmute. Sorry, Sandra. Yes, really good question, Rosie. Thank you. We focused on the correlations so far within the four table stakes and the 4 circle of opportunity criteria. So we haven't covered all of the points that you're looking at. For example, we haven't looked at quality of marketing yet. With capacity to innovate, I think that has we're seeing that less strongly correlated with other criteria in the lower and the mid performing firms, and more clearly present in the high performing firms. And again, ESG, what we're seeing is, as I say, that clearly dropping off in the mid and low performing firms. Those relationships with the other key criteria not as strong. That's definitely something we'd like to do more on, I think, and particularly bring in some of the other criteria like marketing, which don't sit within those 2 key groups at the moment. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you, Maureen. Yes, and as you said, there's a lot of correlations that we're still looking at, and I know that Coventry is, digging deeper into sort of saying, well, how are we coming out and what can we learn? And as we saw throughout Maureen's presentation, is actually where can those who are leading perhaps help those who are not seen to be performing as well as others. And I would say not seen to be, because they may be, but they may not be talking about it. Yeah, so as always is, what does that narrative look like? How are we coming out on these sort of things as well? So great question. We promise to look into it certainly between now and the next time we come back together again and have some more insight on that one. But it's an interesting one, along with talent acquisition, I think, in relation to innovation and how we manage people.